April Beth Pitzer, a former model and mother of two, had gotten herself into a world of danger. Prior to moving to Texas, where she married and later had 2 daughters, she was on the wrong side of the law. Following a DWI arrest, April was offered the chance to clean the slate, work as a confidential informant, and infiltrate the drug culture of Arkansas, and her past mistakes would be forgotten. Wired for sound and with video surveillance watching, April worked the clubs and bars of Arkansas, making connections to numerous buyers, sellers, and individuals in the drug trade. She had no way of knowing how far and wide it all reached, though, and that she was in the middle of a major drug ring which stretched from the mountains of Arkansas all the way to Southern California. When her identity was compromised, April fled to Texas, where she began her life anew. She met a man, got married, and was pregnant with her first daughter when the past came back to haunt her. April was forced to return to Arkansas, where she testified in a trial that sent dozens of people connected to the ring to federal prison. After that, April was never quite the same. Paranoid and worried that her life was in danger, her stress eventually led to drinking and a mental breakdown. Her marriage collapsed, and her 2 young daughters were removed from her custody. Devastated, not knowing what to do, and seeking refuge, April fled to California to put her life back together. Against all odds and in an unfortunate twist of fate, April found herself in California, surrounded by many people who had been connected to the drug ring she had testified against. No one knew until one night when she recognized a woman whose husband had gone to jail. Scared and surrounded by people with a reason to want revenge, April planned to go home to Arkansas. While staying at the home of a friend for safety, April disappeared, and in the 14 years since, her mother Gloria has fought long and hard to locate her. Rumors abound that April was murdered and dumped into one of the thousands of abandoned mine shafts in the area. A maze-like network of dark tunnels, long since abandoned, may now hold the answers to April Pitzer's fate. This is Trace Evidence, Episode 59, The Vanishing of April Pitzer. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today we examine the disturbing disappearance of 30-year-old April Pitzer from Newberry Springs, California. Before getting into the case, just a few notes about the show. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focusing on a different unsolved case each week. Subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, or your favorite podcatcher. If you have questions, comments, or case suggestions, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. Follow me on Twitter at TraceEvPod, on Instagram at TraceEvidencePod, or join the Facebook discussion group simply by searching for Trace Evidence. You can visit the website at trace-evidence.com for full episodes, transcripts, social media links, merchandise, and much more. Trace Evidence is also on Patreon, so if you'd like to support the show, please visit patreon.com/traceevidence, where you can get rewards such as stickers, pins, and commercial-free episodes. There's also a PayPal donation link on the website for those of you who don't wish to go through Patreon. This show is a complete one-man operation, and your support is greatly appreciated. As a final note, I'll be making an appearance at a podcast meetup in Atlanta this October. The meetup will be comprised of other true crime podcasts, including The Fall Line, Moms and Murder, Corpus Delicti, and many more. The event will take place between 2 and 5 p.m. at the Thinking Man Tavern on Saturday, October 13th. For more information, visit trace-evidence.com. and I hope to see you there. Today we examine the disappearance of April Pitzer, a case which has haunted me for a long time. My understanding of this case was completely transformed as I researched it, and I learned so much more than what I'd imagined. If you believe you've heard this case before, there's a good chance you've not even scratched the surface. This is episode 59, The Vanishing of April Pitzer. April Beth was born on February 19th, 1974, to Gloria Danton. At the time April was born, Gloria was young, and it was a challenge for her to raise a daughter. April's father was a former military man and Vietnam veteran. Whatever struggles or issues may have existed at the time, it was Gloria's determination that she would raise her daughter and do whatever it took to provide for her and to be the best mother she could. However, when April was just 3 years old, Gloria lost custody of her to relatives. In an interview, Gloria later said, quote, "I was 19 years old and they thought I was too young to be a mother." End quote. Despite the separation, Gloria remained present. She and April developed a strong bond and relationship, and to this day, Gloria remains in possession of letters she received from April, telling her how much she loved her and wanted to be with her. Gloria described her daughter as a beautiful, smart, and funny young woman. The love between the two of them was absolutely palpable to anyone who was around them, and Gloria remembers fondly how April was not only her daughter, but her best friend. Later in life, the two would be mistakenly believed to be sisters. April was the kind of woman who didn't struggle to make friends, and according to many who knew her, it would be difficult to find someone who almost didn't immediately find themselves enthralled by her loving and caring personality. Even from a young age, April seemed to possess a caregiving disposition and would go out of her way to ensure the comfort and care of others. However, her personality had a taste for excitement as well. According to Gloria, April was a thrill seeker and enjoyed living a little on the edge. Some of her favorite activities were listed as being hiking, rock climbing, and even hang gliding. Living in northwestern Arkansas certainly provided its fair share of outdoor activities to be sought. Clarksville, Arkansas sits in Johnson County, between the Arkansas River and the foothills of the Ozark Mountains. Not a large city by any measure, its current population is just below 10,000 residents over 19 square miles. April's interest, though, didn't keep her outdoors all the time. She thoroughly enjoyed cooking, perhaps as it connects distinctly to her caregiving nature and wanting to do things for others. April also loved music and was fond of singing whenever she could get the opportunity. Gloria has said that she's always been a music lover herself and believes she likely influenced her daughter's tastes. After many years of fighting to keep a relationship with April and working to regain custody fully, when April turned 17 in 1991, she made the choice, as she was now legally capable of doing, to move back in with her mother. The bond between the two only became stronger, and Gloria would later say that she and April became inseparable. In a poignant recollection about their reunion, Gloria recalled how April had told her now that they'd gotten back to each other, nothing could ever separate them again. Now older and growing into an adult, April was able to expand the world of her experiences and set her sights on what it was she wanted to do with the rest of her life. Regardless of what path may lay ahead of her, Gloria was there for her and was constantly supportive of her daughter. Eventually, Gloria decided that she was going to be moving to East Texas and asked April to come with her. Considering the tightness of their relationship and how they'd separated in the past, Gloria believed her daughter would come along, but to her surprise, April expressed her interest in staying in Clarksville. Perhaps it was due to connections she had there, friends and family. The majority of her life had been spent there. Gloria never truly understood her daughter's choice, but she was an adult and capable of making her own decisions. Regardless of the distance, mother and daughter maintained contact and spoke on the phone frequently. There was nothing in April's life that Gloria wasn't privy to, including when April found herself in a great deal of trouble and danger just a few years later. When April was in her early 20s, she found herself on the wrong side of the law. Deciding to go out for a night of fun, she went to a local bar and had a few drinks. During the evening, she met and befriended two young women. April's electric personality was, as always, a magnet to those around her. As the group talked, the two women expressed that they weren't sure how they'd be getting home that night. April volunteered to drive them, but unfortunately, she was not yet completely sober. During the drive, an officer spotted April's vehicle veering slightly off course. When she was pulled over, April was given a field sobriety test, which she failed. Ultimately, she was charged with a DWI. Things went from bad to worse when the officer asked the two passengers to exit the vehicle and he discovered methamphetamine in their possession. April was brought down to the station to be processed for the DWI, a misdemeanor carrying the possibility of a fine and jail time. Upset and concerned about what might happen to her, April was approached by officers about the possibility of becoming a drug informant. Being that she had only been arrested for a DWI, it's a little bizarre that they assumed she was running in the drug world. There's been a lot of speculation about why she was specifically chosen for this, though the common belief was that since she had two women in the car with her who were in possession of meth, it was believed she may have been moving in those kinds of circles. Either way, April agreed to work as an informant. This would require her to operate under the oversight of a handler located in Little Rock, and through whom she would be given information about operations. April would be asked to visit bars and clubs, where she would make connections, purchase drugs, and try to get names and information. Many of these interactions would involve video and audio surveillance. At the time, there was a massive drug ring operating in the area. According to reports, the drug ring stretched from Clarksville all the way to Southern California. Chemicals needed for the production of meth would be acquired in Arkansas, at which time they'd be sent out west. Once the drugs were manufactured, they would make their way back into the state for sale and distribution. At the time, April was not aware of how far and wide the scale of the activity was. Her undercover work lasted for several months, and during that time, law enforcement were able to get a larger grasp on the operation. Her work had been invaluable to their investigation, and they managed to capture a large amount of transactions on tape. All the while she was working for them, April kept her mother in the loop with what was going on. While Gloria was concerned about her daughter, April felt that it wasn't that big of a deal, and it was keeping her from facing the DWI charges. Unfortunately, things would eventually take a turn. Whether there was leaking information or simply a matter of connecting the dots, April's work as a confidential informant was slowly discerned. When it became clear that April was compromised, law enforcement moved in quickly and pulled her out of the operation. Some very dangerous people were now aware of her possible involvement, and she was advised to leave the area and to not reveal her location to anyone. Not wanting to pull Gloria into this, and she didn't want to put her mother's safety at risk, April fled to Texas, heading into the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Some reports have stated that at the time, April may have been in Longview, Texas. She had family there, an aunt and an uncle on her father's side, and she was able to move into their apartment and stay with them for the time being. While she had been compromised, April felt somewhat relieved, as it appeared that she would now be out from under the thumb of law enforcement and free to move on with her life. Unfortunately, her home state of Arkansas was not a safe place for her to be anymore. She may have believed, around this time, that things would eventually blow over and she'd be safe to return home. After a while, things did begin to settle down, and April found herself a routine in her new area. She got along well with her relatives and didn't mind being down in Texas. She did have to leave everything behind in Arkansas, but fate, as it seemed, would intervene, and through the trials and tribulations, April would begin the next phase of her life. While spending an afternoon down by the pool at the apartment complex, she met Chase Pitzer, a smart, confident, and impressive young man. April was almost immediately smitten, and for Chase, the feeling was mutual. Chase came from a well-to-do family, his father at the time being a multi-millionaire, and while April was drawn to him for his charm and care, the security and comfort of a life undeterred by living paycheck to paycheck was certainly an additional bonus. Their romance was strong and swift, a whirlwind, and before she knew it, April was head over heels for the new man in her life. It was clear to everyone around the two that there was something special between them. Gloria found Chase to be a good man, someone who cared deeply for her daughter. She later stated, quote, "Chase loved her. He loved her very much, and she loved him." End quote. The two would end up getting married, and April's father-in-law purchased a large, beautiful house for them to live in. It seemed like everything was coming together for April, and the mistakes of her past had been left behind. At the same time, while everyone was happy for the couple, that may not have been entirely true. It's been suggested that April's new in-laws didn't necessarily approve of their son's choice in a wife. It's been said that they didn't approve of her past, they weren't happy when they learned about her previous work as a confidential informant, and for the most part, applied pressure to the relationship. Despite this, Chase remained devoted to his wife. April became pregnant in late 1997, early 1998, with her first daughter. She and Chase were extremely excited by the news and couldn't wait to begin raising a family together. April's caregiving nature had always been there, but now her life would be fulfilled by the arrival of a child. Unfortunately, when April reached her 8th month of pregnancy, she received a visit from the past. While living in her Fort Worth home, there came a knock at the door. It was an officer from the Drug Enforcement Agency. April was informed that arrests had been made in connection to the drug ring in which she had been working as an informant, and they wanted her to return to Arkansas to testify in the trial. It couldn't have come at a worse time, and April was not excited by the prospect. According to Gloria, when confronted by the situation, April initially attempted to back out. She told law enforcement officials that she had a new life. She wasn't interested in going back to Arkansas, and she definitely didn't want to testify in open court against dangerous drug runners. From the point of view of the DEA, though, the situation was cut and dry. It's been alleged that April was told she would either return to Arkansas and testify, or not only would they follow up on the DWI charge, but they would also consider prosecuting her as someone involved in the drug operation. They had surveillance footage of her spending time with drug dealers and making buys, certainly enough to link her to the ring. Whether or not these charges would have stuck, or if it was a bluff, it's difficult to say, but it's fairly common for individuals brought in as informants to be pressured in this way. So in the late summer of 1998, April was taken back to Arkansas to testify. This certainly didn't make the situation with her in-laws any easier, and it was the first time that Gloria became aware of the fact that April had initially come to Texas when she fled from her identity being compromised. According to Gloria, when April returned to Arkansas, security was tight. Federal officers were placed on guard, protecting her around the clock. She was kept in motels and moved frequently in order to keep members of the drug operation from finding her location. For her testimony, April would be led into the courtroom surrounded by officers while wearing protective gear, including a hood which was meant to protect her identity. Allegedly, April was only one witness, and there was at least one other, a man who may have been murdered later. I've been unable to verify that detail, but that is one of the stories that's being told. A lot of the information in this case can be difficult to wrap your head around, and for many, the details of what happened and who was involved can become overwhelming. Unfortunately, issues surrounding the drug trade and the transportation of chemicals and supplies in and out of Arkansas have been well documented. A quick Google search of Arkansas drug rings will bring back a large amount of results, and for those of you who have read about or heard discussion of another famous case alleged to be connected to drugs, the Boys on the Tracks, that terrible incident which resulted in the deaths of Kevin Ives and Don Henry, that took place only 10 years earlier, in 1987, just 100 miles away from Clarksville in Alexander, Arkansas, and that is but one example of the influence of drug operations in the area. Arkansas drug rings even connect back to a case previously covered on Trace Evidence, episode 48, The Mysterious Death of Chuck Morgan. That case involved discussion of a reporter, Danny Casolaro, who, among other items, was investigating the possibility of a drug operation being run through the Mena Intermountain Regional Airport in Mena, Arkansas, located approximately 115 miles from Clarksville. In fact, if you look at a map of Arkansas and you connect the dots from Mena to Alexander to Clarksville, you'd have a triangular shape, with Clarksville being the tip on that pyramid. Suffice it to say, there were multiple drug rings operating at the time, which ranged far and wide across the state, and April found herself in the middle of a very complicated and dangerous situation. In her particular case, the suspects involved ranged from Little Clarksville all the way to the Barstow area of Southern California, some 1,400 miles away. This case went far beyond the bounds of the small-time dealers and drug trade April thought she would be going up against when she was first acquired. Regardless of the danger involved in the case, April did ultimately provide testimony to support and substantiate surveillance footage which had been captured during her time operating as an informant. Her testimony was considered a vital part of the trial which, in the end, resulted in the convictions of more than 30 individuals connected to the drug ring, most of whom would serve time in federal prison. One name involved in the case was another young woman, Brandy Brooks. Brandy was sentenced to 8 years probation, though her husband was not so lucky and was given 8 years in prison, of which he eventually served 7. As a result of their convictions, their children were removed from their custody. In the grand scheme of things, their charges and sentences were minor compared to what others faced, but in a bizarre twist, Brandy's name will come up again and may in fact be connected to April's disappearance 6 years later. Following her testimony, April returned home to Fort Worth. She gave birth to her daughter, and things appeared to be returning to normal, but it soon became clear that April had been traumatized by the experience. It was a slow progression, but April became extremely paranoid about those she sent to prison, and more so, who they may have had connections to that were not in prison. Gloria later stated, quote, "She was never the same. She looked over her shoulder everywhere she went." End quote. In fact, April was so worried that someone may find her that she began using alternate names, sometimes going by April Pitzer, and other times using her mother's maiden name and even her father's last name. According to Gloria, April didn't attempt to get a Texas driver's license because she was afraid to reveal her true identity, and this resulted in her receiving multiple tickets and fines for driving without a license. Eventually, April became pregnant again with her second daughter. Being a mother was the one thing which seemed to keep her grounded, which supported her, which lent her the ability to feel herself again. The entire experience with the situation in Arkansas had made her feel a little lost, but it was in her girls that she found her purpose. That kind, caring, and gentle nature was at its best when she was around her daughters, and to her, they were her entire world. At the same time, April's paranoia was growing and adding stress on her marriage. Living in a nice big home, April refused to allow her daughters to sleep in their bedrooms and instead would put them in the master bedroom. April herself was avoiding sleep as much as possible, staying awake and watchful in case anyone showed up. Eventually, Extra locks were added to the doors and surveillance cameras were installed in an attempt to appease April, but even still, she felt they weren't safe. Gloria later said, quote, "She was scared somebody was going to come through the windows and kill them, and all of this paranoia started really taking its toll on her marriage itself." End quote. April and Chase's relationship was suffering, and the two began having a lot of problems. Disagreements started happening more frequently and involving more complex issues. April's paranoia was wearing Chase down, and while he loved his wife, he couldn't find a way to make her feel safe. Eventually, April began seeking out solace through alcohol. Her drinking quickly became an issue, and then, April just completely broke down. After several visits with doctors and psychologists, she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. On the one hand, the diagnosis provided some possible reasons behind her behavior, but April herself was unhappy with the treatment options. April was prescribed several medications, but it didn't seem to agree with her. Eventually, April stopped taking the medication, which certainly didn't help with her lack of sleep and paranoia. It's always been considered a curiosity, her diagnosis, and whether the trial was the source of her worries, the bipolar itself, or some combination of the two. This added an extra layer of stress and difficulty to the marriage, though despite the issues, it was clear that there was still love there. Eventually, April and Chase divorced, but they weren't yet ready to give up on each other. It's been said that even as they signed their divorce papers, they were rekindling their relationship. There was certainly a very back and forth period going on, and Gloria believes the divorce itself may have initially been for show. Chase's parents were unhappy with the situation and were working to get their son out of the marriage, whether or not he wanted it. In fact, multiple times after the divorce, the two got back together and kept it secret from his parents. Despite their efforts to make things work, it was eventually made clear that things had grown beyond their control. By February of 2003, April's drinking, paranoia, and bipolar were wearing her down. She moved out of the house, taking her two daughters with her into an apartment. Now faced with the need to provide for her children and herself, April took a job working at a local gas station convenience store. While she felt that she was doing the best she could, Chase and her in-laws disagreed. Upon returning home one day, she found Child Protective Services officials, as well as Chase and her former mother-in-law, in the apartment. April was informed that, following an examination of the residence and her admission that she wasn't taking her medication, the children were going to be removed from her custody. At the time, CPS told her that if she found a more appropriate residence and got back on her medication, she would be subject to a new review and may regain partial or full custody of the children. This was an absolutely devastating blow to the young mother. Not in the right state of mind, dealing with the removal of her children, and struggling to make a living to support herself, April began to drift. It was around this time that she met a man named John Lopez, who offered her an option. He was going to be returning home to Hinckley, California, and asked April if she wanted to come along. Or at least, that's how it's often been explained in coverage of this case. The reality, though, is quite different. John Lopez, at the time he met April, was married to a woman named Rose. Their life was complicated, as John was well known at the time to be involved in illegal activities. It's been alleged that Lopez was a car thief, and his marriage was based around an open relationship. While in many areas it's been suggested that Lopez and April were engaged in a relationship at the time, many people have contradicted this, including Gloria. According to friends and family, April was friendly with the Lopezes, and they offered to bring her to California. They explained that maybe if April left town for a while, took a break, and put herself back together, she'd be better equipped to handle the situation. In addition to that, they argued that her in-laws and ex-husband might miss her. Absence makes the heart grow fonder, and through her absence they would become more accepting of allowing her to be around the kids more and working out some kind of a custody agreement. Ultimately, April agreed to go west with the Lopezes, though this would be the first in a series of poor choices, which would lead her into a dangerous world. April left for California in December of 2003, and it happened rather quickly. One day, she was in Texas, and the next, she was gone. She believed that she might be able to put her life back together, get into a better position, and hoped that she would be able to reconnect with her children upon her return. She ended up in San Bernardino County, which is not what most people imagine when they think of California. It's rather desolate, with a large desert-like environment. She was in the area of places such as Barstow, Daggett, and Newberry Springs. The surrounding area is not the most inviting. Jobs can be difficult to find, and it's commonly thought to be a location of high drug traffic. Barstow is often referred to as the methamphetamine capital of the world. It can be difficult for an outsider to come into this location and begin a life there, and it can also be challenging to steer clear of the bad drug world. Other than the unwelcoming environment, there were a series of issues which revolved around her connection to the Lopezes. Firstly, they sold April a Jeep, which she drove out west, but upon arriving, found that they were being strange about the title. Every time she requested to be given the title, they would have an excuse as to why they couldn't. Either way, April believed that they had what was best in mind for her. John Lopez, in several interviews, has claimed that he warned April about the drug culture, which areas were right and which to avoid, but at the same time also admits to taking her to a party in the desert, which was inhabited by drug users and dealers. The party took place in January of 2004. According to John, April met a man there, Mike Brunel. Brunel was riding a dirt bike, and April asked for a ride. John says he got annoyed and left. According to Gloria, though, John and his wife Rose brought April to this party, and when she got onto Brunel's dirt bike, not only did they leave, but they took the Jeep with them, essentially abandoning her in the middle of the desert with a group of strangers. The Jeep, as it would later turn out, was stolen, which explained why they weren't able to supply her with a title. After the Lopezes left, April eventually returned from her ride on Brunel's bike and found herself stranded. She had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. At the time, Brunel informed her that he and his brother lived on a 20-acre spread and that there were several mobile homes on the property, one of which would be vacated soon, and she could live there if she wanted. Without any real options and believing that Brunel was trying to help her, April agreed. I should note, there are some questions about the possessions of April's in relation to the Lopezes after this, though for the most part it seems all connections were severed. There is a story about April attempting to either get the Jeep back or possibly some of her possessions, and this resulted in her being shot at, but the story is speculative at best. Either way, April was now in the Brunel clan, living in Newberry Springs, 20 miles east of Barstow. Newberry Springs is an unincorporated community in the western Mojave Desert. Its population is less than 3,000, and it is far from a bustling town. Now, without transportation, a job, or any way to really take care of herself, April was at the whim of the Brunels. It didn't take long for things to transform from bad to worse, and it became apparent that not everything going on their land was on the level. Brunel has been suggested to have been involved in several illegal activities, including the drug trade. It's around this time that April herself seems to have begun falling into drugs and deeper into alcohol. Spread on the land, Brunel had several people living there, and one of them was a man named Steve Wilkinson. Wilkinson befriended April, but again, here we have a situation where not everyone is as they seem. For years, Wilkinson was represented as being a kind gentleman who had a troubled past, but had left it all behind. As it turns out, Wilkinson was a major player in the drug trade, and some have even referred to him as one of the more prominent drug lords in all of Southern California. Wilkinson was actually in federal prison when April testified in 1998, for his connection to the drug ring stretching from California to Arkansas. At the time, Wilkinson had no idea that he was spending his time with a former confidential informant. Through Brunel and Wilkinson, April came to know two other men, Chuck Aleister and a man everyone referred to as Danton. Aleister was a Vietnam veteran whom many referred to as Uncle Chuck. He had been in the area quite a while and owned his own home, which was a rarity, and he was known to take in drifters and people down on their luck. For the most part, many considered him to be a decent guy who was always out to lend a hand. There was, though, a darker side to Aleister. He was known to be a drug abuser and could have a violent temper, and his association with Danton made things all the more sinister. Danton sometimes lived on Aleister's property, but usually stayed in old abandoned mining shacks, and was known in the area as a dangerous individual. San Bernardino County was a major area during the California gold rush of the mid to late 1800s. As a result of gold being found, thousands upon thousands of people came to the area believing they were going to strike it rich. Left behind in their wake are more than 20,000 abandoned mines. Some of these mines are still worked today. Others are abandoned and scattered throughout the countryside. There are dangerous pits leading down into an incredible network of twisting and turning tunnels going down hundreds of feet. Danton worked a mine, which he named the Red Dog Mine, located in Ludlow, California. Danton decided that he owned the area and was extremely aggressive about others coming near the shacks or his mine, for which he actually did have a claim. For many, Danton was a dangerous man, and there were rumors that he'd killed in the past. An alcoholic and drug addict, he was paranoid and had a tendency towards violence. As a warning to would-be wanderers, scrawled all around the area in various abandoned shacks are the words of Danton. Some of the things he'd written include, 3 people can keep a secret if 2 are dead, and you can leave or you can disappear. I can help you disappear. No problem. Perhaps just the scrawlings of a rambling old man, but this became the circle that April was running in. Danton, Wilkinson, Aleister, and the Brunels. It didn't take long for the sweet southern girl to feel completely overwhelmed and scared. Her use of drugs and alcohol was overtaking her, and she became completely dependent on those around her. Issues between April and Brunel began building up, and it became a major problem within their little community. It's difficult to keep track of everything that went on, as there are so many stories, but one which seems to be verified tells the tale of a particularly violent encounter between April, Brunel, Aleister, and Danton. At the time, April and Brunel had been given permission by Danton to explore the mines in his area, out of curiosity, and in the hopes that they might pull up something of value. After one particular instance, Danton accused them of stealing truck parts from him to sell for drug money. This situation eventually exploded out of control and led to rumors of a high-speed chase, abduction, and when it was all said and done, April had a bullet wound in her leg. Wilkinson nursed April back to health and notified Gloria, telling her that the injury wasn't major and she'd be alright. Gloria was absolutely beside herself, trying to get April to come back home, but for whatever reason, April wasn't ready to leave yet. This leads to the breakup between April and Brunel, and then she found herself homeless, jobless, and without any prospects. She spent her nights sleeping on couches and staying with friends when she could. She never knew where her next meal was going to come from and who would provide it. Ashamed and scared, when she did speak to her mother, she lied and claimed things were going well, that she was working and living in a nice area, but in reality, her life was collapsing into a personal hell. Following her life with Brunel, the issues with Danton and Chuck, the gunshot wound, and the utter implosion of her world, April had a breakdown. One day, after her leg had healed, she found herself aimlessly wandering down Route 66. Desperate for help, unsure of who to turn to, and too ashamed to ask her mother for help, she didn't know what to do. The entire situation had gotten out of hand, and as she walked down the road, a man named Mark Killebrew stopped by and noticed the unkempt and clearly upset woman. He asked April if she was all right, if she needed help. At the time, April just collapsed. She sobbed and told Mark all of her problems and issues, and Mark, finding himself compelled to help, told her to get into his truck. He drove her over to his mother Barbara's house, where the two quickly became friends. Barbara was elderly and had difficulty moving around, and this fed into April's caregiving nature. She wanted to help, and she needed the companionship, someone who actually cared about her and didn't just see her as a means to an end. Barbara listened when April told her everything that had happened, and eventually convinced her to call Gloria and tell her the truth. It was a heartbreaking phone call when April confessed everything, told her mother how she'd been homeless, how she'd been living, and the type of people she'd been spending her time with. She asked Gloria to send her out some clothes, and Gloria purchased several items and shipped them out to her. April was just so happy to have cleared her chest and to have received the clothing. Gloria had been asking April to come back home, and finally she agreed. She missed her daughters, she missed her mother, she wanted to come home, she wanted help, and she was ready to do it. Gloria herself was in the process of moving back to Clarksville, Arkansas, and April told her that when she got back there, she'd move in with her. She didn't want to complicate the move and make things difficult, so she'd wait until the time was right. Gloria would wire her the money for a bus ticket. Unfortunately, that day would never come. In the meantime, April was spending her days taking care of Barbara, but her nights were still in question. She ended up staying with Wilkinson for a while, who later stated, quote, "She'd been staying at my house maybe a couple of weeks or something like that, but she wanted to go see her kids, and that was a good thing for her to do, you know? It was time for her to leave." End quote. Finally, after 6 months of living in California and struggling to make it, falling in with the wrong crowd and suffering from drug and alcohol problems, things seemed to be changing, and April was going to turn her life back around. Then, on Tuesday, June 22, 2004, while hanging out with Wilkinson and several others, she saw someone from her past which scared her down to her very core. While speaking with the woman, she quickly discovered that it was Brandy Brooks, one of the people she had testified against back in Arkansas, a woman whose husband was serving time, who was on probation, and whose children had been taken away due to April's involvement as a confidential informant. According to Gloria, the encounter completely shook April, and she was frightened. When they spoke on the phone, Gloria responded, quote, "I said, 'Oh my God, April, you've got to get out of there. You're gonna die.'" End quote. Brandy had a connection to Wilkinson and may have even given birth to one of his children, though I couldn't verify that detail. Wilkinson claimed that April exposed herself when she apologized to Brandy about her role in the trial, though for many, that doesn't make a great deal of sense. If she was truly concerned about her identity being known, it wouldn't be logical to reveal it. It's been theorized that Brandy may have recognized her, or April may have been out of it, possibly on drugs, and let the information slide. Either way, she was now surrounded by people who had connections to that drug ring, and they all became aware that she had previously been a confidential informant. This put her at risk in general, but it also made them suspicious that she could still be working for law enforcement. It was a bitter twist of fate that, somehow, April ended up surrounded by many of the people whose lives she had altered, and now they had a reason to want revenge. Gloria wanted April to come home immediately, but April told her she'd wait until she was in Clarksville, and in the meantime, she'd find somewhere safe to stay. Gloria suggested that April could stay with Barbara, but at the time, Barbara was in the hospital. Instead, she left Wilkinson's house and turned to Chuck Hollister, looking to stay with him until it was time to go back. Gloria was concerned since Chuck had played a role in the encounter with Danton, which resulted in April getting shot. But at the time, April assured her mother she'd be safe. Chuck and Danton had had a falling out, and he was no longer welcome on Chuck's property. Reluctantly, Gloria agreed. This would be the last conversation Gloria would ever have with her daughter, and given April's financial state, she didn't have a cell phone. All calls coming in to Gloria came from other people's houses, including Chuck's, and for the most part, April would call collect. Chuck's home was set back a little ways off Route 66, and the entry point was protected by 2 gates which he kept padlocked. On Saturday, June 26th, Barbara was released from the hospital and Chuck drove April over to see her. During the visit, April explained that she was planning to go home to Arkansas. The 2 friends bid each other goodbye, and April picked up several of her belongings which had been left at Barbara's home. Barbara also gave April a white suitcase to take with her, since she had nothing to bring her belongings home in. This would be the last time Barbara would ever see April, and according to her, at the time, everything seemed fine. She didn't act like she was scared or worried. She was her usual kind and bubbly self. Over the course of the next few days, Gloria placed several calls to Chuck's house. The phone would ring, but it was never picked up. She wasn't immediately worried, as it wasn't uncommon for April to go for short periods without contacting her, but she knew the time for April to come home was approaching, and she wanted to finalize the arrangements. Following the revelation about Brandy Brooks, she wanted to check in and make sure everything was okay. She kept leaving messages and placing calls, but she simply couldn't get through. Then, in July, she received a call which would change her life forever. Barbara called Gloria and asked her how April was doing and if she was happy to have her back home. Gloria was confused and told Barbara that April hadn't come home, but Barbara insisted she'd taken a bus back to Arkansas as she'd planned. She hadn't seen her since the 26th, and April had told her she was going back. Gloria explained that she was supposed to wire the money for the bus ride, but she couldn't get in touch with April and she didn't know where she was. Gloria later said, quote, "I said, 'Barbara, something's happened to April. Who was the last person with her?' And she said, 'Chuck Hollister. He brought her out here to get her stuff.'" End quote. Detective Steve Pennington, later, when asked about Chuck on that day, explained, quote, "He had taken her to several friends' houses. He had taken her to Barbara's house. She was telling everybody goodbye. She had packed her stuff, and her stuff was ready to go." End quote. Working off of Barbara's account and unable to reach Chuck, it had been 8 days since anyone could confirm seeing April. Scared and concerned, Gloria called to file a missing persons report, but was informed she couldn't file that report unless she was in the state. When she explained the situation, Gloria contends that police told her that April had had a bad marriage, lost her kids, and that she wasn't missing. She just didn't want to be found. After struggling to get someone to take her seriously, Gloria called Barbara and asked her to file a missing persons report since she's in the state. The report was filed on July 16th, and the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department began an investigation, but it was almost immediately met with obstacles. Of the people they could track down who knew April, none claimed to know where she was or what may have happened to her. Missing persons flyers were manufactured and placed in Barstow, Newberry Springs, Daggett, and surrounding areas, but no tips were being called in. For all intents and purposes, it appeared as though April had simply vanished without a trace. 4 days after the report was filed, on July 20th, Gloria finally received a phone call from Chuck Hollister. According to him, he'd been out of town helping a friend move up to Oregon, and he hadn't been around to answer her calls. Keep Oregon in mind, it'll play another role in the case later. When he's asked where April was, he explained that he thought she'd gone home. Chuck alleged that he'd woken up one morning to go to work, and April was sleeping in the guest room. When he came home, She was gone, and he'd assumed she'd caught a ride to the bus station with someone. Strangely though, when asked if her luggage was still there, Chuck confirmed that it was. In a completely different story, Chuck later alleged that April had gone to stay with Steve Wilkinson for a few days. This immediately sent up red flags, as Wilkinson was involved in the drug trade and had a direct connection to Brandy Brooks. Gloria began to wonder if Wilkinson may have been involved in April's disappearance. Detective Pennington went out to Chuck's home to speak with him, and Chuck gave him the same story. When Pennington asked to be let inside to look around, Chuck refused to allow him access. Later, another detective, Marie Spain, paid a visit to Chuck also. He again told the story that he had come home from work and April was gone, but this time he gave a completely different date that it happened. The stories simply weren't adding up, and when Gloria spoke to Detective Spain about the second encounter, she placed a call to Chuck wanting to question him about the discrepancy. Unfortunately, by the time Gloria called him back just the next day, he'd already changed his phone number. With Chuck unwilling to fully cooperate and everyone else claiming they had no knowledge of April's whereabouts, detectives had very little to go on. A month and a half would pass before detectives would catch their first lead. On September 9th, a Barstow City Transit employee overheard a bizarre comment from a passenger. According to Detective Pennington, quote, "A person getting on the local transit bus had seen the flyer at the transit station and had made the comment that she knew that person, knew April, and made the comment that, 'I know where she's at, she's in a hole,' end quote." The transit employee notified the police of the comment, and they were actually able to track down the passenger. When confronted by the information, the woman claimed that she hadn't made that comment. She did, though, eventually admit that she had attended a party and had overheard someone there explain that April had been killed and her body had been concealed in a mine shaft. While authorities now had a place to start, it was an overwhelming task. With more than 20,000 mines in the area and countless tunnels, the sheriff's department simply didn't have the researchers to search all of the areas, and many of them are unsafe to enter. David Van Norman, the deputy coroner and missing persons coordinator, stated, quote, "The desert is vast, and it really doesn't help to say that somebody might have been placed into a mine in light of the fact that there were literally thousands and thousands of mines." End quote. In hopes of getting extra eyes on the situation, Van Norman contacted Joe Pizzatola, a local who knew many of the mines, was a historian, and often led tours of the areas. Joe was asked to keep an eye out for anything out of the ordinary he might see. In an even more bizarre situation, later in the same week that the woman had made the comment about April being in a hole, a haunting scroll of graffiti was found written on the walls of a bathroom. Hundreds of miles to the north, at an Oregon truck stop, an employee discovered the following statement: "Looking for missing girl from Arkansas, 3 miles east of Barstow, I-15 freeway." Authorities traveled to Oregon to discuss what had been found and were informed that the bathrooms were frequently cleaned, suggesting that whoever had written it would likely have been in the truck stop that day or fairly recently. There's a camera facing the hall leading to the men's room. The truck stop is open 24 hours a day, and the camera is always running. Police were given the surveillance footage going all the way back to June, the month that April vanished. Unfortunately, there were hundreds of hours of footage to go through and not enough resources to invest in checking all of it. Gloria eventually was given copies of the footage, of which she watched hours. On one particular day, she noticed a man who she believed closely resembled Chuck Aleister. One point of contact for Gloria early on was Chuck's daughter, Tricia. Tricia and Chuck had long since been estranged, and she was devoted to helping Gloria get to the bottom of what had happened and to locate April. When Gloria spotted the man who appeared to be Chuck, Tricia was called in to verify this information. While she agreed that the man closely resembled her father, she couldn't say it with certainty. She believed that the man in the footage was taller and broader than Chuck. However, it is important to remember that Chuck claimed he had been out of town, helping a friend move to Oregon, and that's why he hadn't been in contact with Gloria for several weeks after April vanished. The San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department conducted a large-scale search in the area specified in the graffiti. The search encompassed an area from Barstow to the Calico exit of I-15, over rough and rocky terrain. Unfortunately, this area is home to hundreds of mine shafts. While authorities searched extensively, they were not able to examine every nook and cranny of the area. It was far and wide and too extensive, but they did focus in on shafts nearing the edge of the interstate, believing that it was unlikely that if April had been disposed of in a shaft, that whoever had done it would wander too far into the area to complete the task. Ultimately, nothing was found. In desperation, Gloria began going through her phone records and calling back every number that April had ever called her from. She received a wide array of responses, from people refusing to talk and others who told all manner of stories and rumors. Most of the information received suggested the belief that April was in the area, had been murdered, and her body was concealed in a mine shaft. While it was difficult to know if these rumors were reliable, there was one specific area which kept coming up in the stories: the mines of Ludlow. Chuck Hollister's former friend, and Steve Wilkinson's current friend, Danton, owned the Red Dog Mine in Ludlow. Authorities had approached Danton several times, but he refused to talk. Detective Pennington explained, quote, "I went by his house on numerous occasions. His vehicle would be there. I'd knock on the door. He wouldn't answer. I would leave my business card. I left missing persons flyers asking him to contact me." End quote. Danton did eventually speak with police, though he claimed that while he had known April, he had no knowledge of what may have happened to her. 6 weeks after Detective Spain visited Chuck Hollister, her partner came back to the home to ask additional questions. Again, Chuck was resistant to talking, and yet again, he told a very different story. This time, Hollister told the police that April had left town with a truck driver and had told him she would return in 3 weeks. According to him, she never came back. This time, when the officer asked to be allowed inside to take a look around, Chuck agreed. Upon examining the home, there didn't appear to be any signs of a crime, and the officer was able to view April's belongings in the home. Authorities were able to conduct a search of the Red Dog Mine. On December 22, 2004, the Barstow Search and Rescue Team entered the mine. They had cadaver dogs with them and conducted an extensive search, going as far down into the mine as they could. The Red Dog has multiple levels, and at this time was difficult to maneuver through. Several areas had to be braced to add additional support, and other sections were overrun by rattlesnakes. It was a challenging search, but the team felt that they had done an extensive job, and unfortunately, nothing was located at that time. Danton maintained that he had no knowledge of what had happened. Chuck Hollister stuck to his story that April hadn't been home when he'd returned home, and Steve Wilkinson denied that April had ever come back to his house after she'd gone to stay with Chuck. All of these people surrounding April in the days and weeks leading up to her disappearance, and yet no one knows what happened. As time passed, police were frustrated by dead ends and a total lack of information. Locals were questioned, and the rumors persisted that April was somewhere in a mine shaft, but nothing had yet been discovered. For Gloria, it was absolutely devastating to have lost her daughter in this way, and she spent each day trying to reach out for answers. After Hollister changed his phone number, she wrote him letter after letter. She sent him missing persons flyers, but Hollister never responded to her. In January of 2005, Andreea Pruitt, owner of the Baghdad Cafe in Newberry Springs, reached out to police. Having seen the missing persons flyer, she recognized April as a former employee. According to Andreea, April had arrived at the cafe in June looking for work. She explained that she was staying at a house nearby and could walk to work if needed. Chuck Hollister lived nearby, so it seems likely that she was staying with him at this time. Andreea remembered April as being sweet and kind, hardworking, and a good employee. She recalled April arriving for work well-dressed, put together with her hair up, and looking professional. But she was more disturbed by the way in which April left the job. Andreea alleged that, on one particular day, April arrived for work and looked disheveled. She was clearly upset about something, and one of her eyes was bruised. Andreea felt that someone may have hit April, but April didn't want to talk about it. When she left work that day, she never returned. She didn't tell Andreea she was quitting or going anywhere, and unfortunately, it wasn't until January, some 7 months later, that Andreea realized April had gone missing. Nearly a year would pass before the next clue in April's case would be discovered. Joe Pizzatola was leading a tour through some mining areas in December of 2005. In Ludlow, the group was led into an abandoned shack when Pizzatola discovered discarded women's clothing. Having been notified by Van Norman about April's case, he immediately pulled the visitors out of the shack and contacted the police. The clothing was found several miles beyond the Red Dog Mine, at a mine known as the Indian Queen. Amongst the items found was a black and red flannel jacket, which Gloria had sent to April. April spoke with the police and told them specifically to look for a black lace bra and a white suitcase. A month later, in January of 2006, Gloria flew out to the area for the first time. Gloria was able to meet with many of the people her daughter had been spending time with. She was struck by the desolate environment and the various shacks and rundown homes scattered throughout the landscape. She hadn't realized the reality of the places April had been spending her time, and the sheer magnitude of the land, hills, and mines all around her was overwhelming. After identifying the flannel, she requested to be taken to the Red Dog Mine that she'd heard so much about. David Van Norman agreed to accompany Gloria to the site, and it didn't take long to find suspicious items. Gloria stepped out of the vehicle and spotted the white suitcase that Barbara had given April. It was right out in the open. Garments were scattered in the area, some of them partially buried. Quickly, Gloria recovered a black lace bra and dug up other items of clothing which she believed were connected to April. The same size, the same style, and April had a tendency to cut a small V into the back of the shirts, and many of the items discovered had this trait. More items of clothing were found scattered between the Red Dog Mine and the Indian Queen. Gloria was frustrated, wondering how investigators could have missed these items, though Detective Spain later indicated that she had seen them, but didn't think they were connected to April. Detective Pennington later stated, quote, "I don't know how the clothing that Gloria says was her daughter's ended up in the desert if it was the same clothes that was at Chuck's house." End quote. Unfortunately, exposure to the elements had deprived the clothing of any forensic value. While in town, Gloria met with detectives to discuss the case. She met Steve Wilkinson and several others that knew April. They all expressed their concern for her well-being, but didn't offer up very much information in terms of what may have happened. At the time, Gloria was unable to speak with either Danton or Chuck Aleister. Eventually, she would return home, but this would be the first of many times she'd find herself in the desert of Southern California. Then, in September of 2006, Chuck Hollister became ill and was on his deathbed. Detective Pennington paid him a visit, offering him the ability to clear his conscience, to tell him if he was involved in what had happened to April. To his dying breath, Aleister claimed innocence and swore that he had no knowledge of what may have happened. He ultimately passed away on September 6th and took whatever knowledge he may have had to the grave. Over the course of the next few years, Gloria made many returns to the area and did her best to have searches conducted. Various groups operating on a volunteer basis began descending into the mines and searching as extensively as they could. On a subsequent visit, Gloria decided she needed to find Danton and speak with him. She sought him out, knocking on doors and asking questions, until finally she was informed that he was in the hospital, in the intensive care unit. When Gloria entered the unit, nursing staff mistakenly believed that she was a family member and informed her that she needed to get Danton to eat. While wearing a shirt with her daughter's missing persons flyer printed on it, Gloria Denton sat in the same room with the man who had shot her daughter in the leg, the man who many believed would now know where to find her remains. Gloria pleaded with him, and according to her, they both cried, and he expressed that April was a good person, but he didn't know what had happened to her, and he hadn't been involved. Though he did make an odd statement that he'd taken Brandy Brooks to his mine one time. Danton later died as the result of his illness, apparently cancer. Shortly thereafter, a woman contacted Detective Pennington. According to this woman, Danton had looked upon her as a surrogate grandmother, and he had done various things for her throughout her life. He had given her rides when she needed them, helped her with her shopping, and would visit and speak with her. The woman claimed that on one visit, not long before his death, Danton wanted to get something off his chest and made a disturbing confession. Danton allegedly stated, "I did her." When the woman asked what he was talking about, she claims Danton told her that he had killed April Pitzer. He then made a statement about Gloria, saying, "She's in the right place, but she hasn't gone far enough." Pennington believes this meant that April was in fact somewhere in a mine, but that she may either be deeper down in an area yet explored, or perhaps in another mine deeper into the desert. Over the course of the next years, dozens of searches were conducted in mines all around the area. Police were involved in many, as have been private search and rescue teams who volunteered to assist. Among those who have searched are Trinity Search and Rescue, who were involved in ground searches over the course of several days, as well as providing satellite imagery of the area. A nonprofit group from Utah, the Mojave Underground, also conducted searches, as did a San Diego-based search team, Underground Explorers. Texas EquiSearch has also participated, and there are even videos released to YouTube by search teams documenting their explorations of the mines. Some of these teams have gone as deep as 3,000 feet down. At various times, garments have been found which may have belonged to April, though nothing more than that. In one particular mine, a pile of stones with a cross was found, though this was believed to have been a memorial towards Chuck Aleister, and nothing related to April. In 2008, a butterfly garden was opened at the Desert Discovery Center in Barstow. It was dedicated in April's memory, in hopes of keeping her name and case alive. Despite the lack of results, Gloria has never given up the search, and returns to the area frequently, mounting new searches with volunteers. Despite her own physical issues, Gloria has gone down into the mines herself, and was searching along with teams of experts. But Gloria wasn't just searching for April in the winding, dark mines of the surrounding area. During her time in California, she spoke with many of the people she believed possessed more knowledge than they're sharing. On several occasions, she even went to these people while wired for sound, capturing the details of their conversations. One person who stuck out in the minds of authorities, who was still alive and may hold the key, was Steve Wilkinson. Wilkinson had been a drug kingpin, and was still operating in that world when April disappeared. He had served time in federal prison for his connection to the drug ring that April testified against, though he was already in prison based on other evidence when she took the stand. In one particular conversation with Gloria, he explained how he believed a woman had stolen marijuana from him once. The woman was then the girlfriend of April's ex, Mike Brunel. In order to discover the location of the missing drugs, a total of 20 pounds, he took the woman out to the desert, where she was tased and beaten. She eventually admitted that Brunel had stolen the drugs. Gloria asked Wilkinson if this was how he treated people who had crossed him, why would she believe that he hadn't done something to April? Allegedly, Wilkinson responded that April was a drinker. She wasn't much into the drug scene, and she would not have stolen from him. When asked about Aleister and Danton, Wilkinson claimed that neither of them would have been involved. They were older and not the type, though when he was later interviewed on television, he changed his story and stated that Danton was a violent man and had likely killed before. According to Gloria, in a separate conversation, Wilkinson began discussing the role April played in the 1998 drug trial. He supposedly told her that April had sent a lot of people to prison, many of whom were either out or who had connections in the area, and those people may have wanted revenge. He even supposedly expressed that his own time in prison may have been due to April's testimony. Gloria said, when she told Wilkinson that April couldn't have been involved in his arrest, since she didn't testify until after he'd already been sentenced, she felt that he responded with shock. A rumor, rampant at the time, suggested that Wilkinson had actually paid Chuck Aleister and Danton to murder and dispose of April as a response to his own incarceration, though as it turned out, she played no role in that aspect of it and had no knowledge of him prior to arriving in California. Wilkinson, though, would soon join the list of names connected to April's disappearance who have since left this earth. On September 1st, 2015, Steve Wilkinson was arrested in a drug raid in which 34 people were charged. According to reports, located in his home at the time were more than 10,000 marijuana plants, over 100 pounds of methamphetamine, more than 200 pounds of processed marijuana, and several pounds of mushrooms. Faced now with charges that would have sent him to prison for the rest of his life, Wilkinson posted $50,000 bail on September 2nd and then made some interesting choices. For the first time, he purchased a life insurance policy. Then, he decided to board a plane in Daggett, California on September 5th, allegedly to fly to Amarillo, Texas for a birthday. The plane, a twin-engine Cessna, was piloted by Harold Joseph Raggio, Wilkinson's father-in-law. Also aboard were Rosalinda Leslie and Michael Riley. The flight left at 7 a.m. and stopped in Flagstaff, Arizona to refuel before continuing on its way, but eventually it would crash down to Earth, killing all occupants at 2:08 p.m. Interestingly, the flight had veered more than 150 miles off course and went down near Silverton, Colorado, in San Juan County. Wilkinson was identified by his tattoos, and no DNA was processed for confirming identities. When asked about the speculation regarding Wilkinson, Ron Hamm Jr., the operator of Daggett Aviation, stated, quote, "Rumors at the local bars? He was either going out there to get money to make a big deal, or to help him with his current lawyer stuff because of that bust, or he was going to be dropped off and never come back." End quote. The National Transportation and Safety Board found multiple issues with the flight, including bad weather for which the pilot was not experienced enough to maneuver. They argued that Raggio had been flying by sight and not using his instruments. There were even issues surrounding the Flagstaff landing, where airport staff have said Raggio was confused about what direction he was heading when told to land, nearly hit another plane while taxiing, went out onto the runway without permission, causing a commercial airliner to change its landing, and that he had difficulty communicating coherently while on the radio. For many, while the story has been that the plane simply veered off course due to pilot error, ultimately crashing, there are other possibilities. Speculation is strong that Wilkinson exited the plane in Flagstaff, and that the flight was purposefully sent off course and crashed to cover up his disappearance. This is, of course, a rumor which has never been verified, but activity on Wilkinson's Facebook account in the years following his death has made some wonder. After the deaths of Wilkinson, Aleister, and Danton, Almost all of the names which have at any point been associated with murdering April are now gone. These 3 men, for most, are considered the most likely suspects, but they never revealed whether or not they were involved. And for Gloria Danton, she believes that her daughter is likely still somewhere out there, in the darkness of a deep mine shaft. She did, for a time, entertain the possibility that April may have been moved. In one particular mine system, for which Detective Pennington was very interested, they found an area which appeared to have been recently dug out. Reportedly, Steve Wilkinson was seen in that area in the week leading up to the plane crash. Gloria can't help but wonder if April's body may have been taken aboard the Cessna and dropped from the sky somewhere between Barstow and Flagstaff. April Pitzer's fate remains unknown, and there is so much rumor and speculation that it can be difficult to narrow down just what exactly are the possibilities. There's a seemingly endless maze of mine shafts to explore, and unfortunately, those believed to possess the answers are gone. In the absence of solid evidence, 3 primary theories have been suggested as to what may have become of April Pitzer. The first theory suggests that a yet unknown individual may have played a role in April's disappearance. From the stories about her having traveled with a truck driver, to the numerous people far and wide whose lives were impacted by the trial in which she testified, many had connections in the area of Southern California from where she vanished. Many believe that once her identity had been revealed in connection to Brandy Brooks, any number of people may have wanted to strike out for revenge. Is it possible that the person or persons responsible may have gotten away with this terrible crime without ever crossing the radar of investigators due to the activities and behaviors of those they were considering, such as Danton, Chuck, and Wilkinson? The second theory purports that Steve Wilkinson may have played a role in April's disappearance, either directly or indirectly. Wilkinson was a career criminal in the drug trade who befriended April, but once he discovered her past as a confidential informant, he would certainly have been suspicious about her. Many, including Gloria, believe that Wilkinson thought April was involved in his own incarceration, and he certainly knew that she was involved in Brandy's, a woman to whom he had a strong connection. Based on the alleged incident in which he once beat and tased a woman to find out who stole marijuana from him, it isn't difficult to imagine what he would have done to someone he thought put him in prison. Wilkinson could have committed the crime himself, but others believe it's possible he may have hired someone to do it. The name most prominently put forward is Danton. The third and final theory is that Danton was ultimately the man responsible for the murder and disposal of April's body, and he may have placed her into one of those mines that he had spent the past 40 years of his life exploring. Danton allegedly confessed to killing April, though we have no way of knowing for sure what exactly occurred and whether or not he was telling the truth. Wilkinson and Danton were tight, and while Danton and Chuck had had a falling out, Wilkinson is still a tie which binds them. For many, they believe that when April decided to leave the area, the choice had to be made whether or not to let her go. With her history as an informant, Wilkinson may have felt that it was too dangerous to allow her to walk away, knowing what she knew. Danton could have, through Chuck, been given access to April. However, Danton used to live with Chuck part of the time, so it's also suggested he knew the home and property well enough to gain access and abduct April, at which point he could have committed this heinous crime. When last seen, April Pitzer was described as being a Caucasian female, standing 5 feet 9 inches tall and weighing between 120 and 130 pounds. She has brown hair and hazel eyes. April has a scar on her elbow, a scar on her lip, a scar on the left side of her stomach, and a small round scar on the left side of her chest. She has several dental implants. She was last reportedly seen in Newberry Springs, California on June 28, 2004. In the 14 years since April Pitzer vanished, Gloria Danton has been desperate for answers. She has transformed herself from a broken mother seeking her daughter to a hardened woman digging through the dirt of California and confronting dangerous people for answers. She has returned to the area more than 28 times and been involved directly with more than 20 searches. Her grandchildren, now grown up, have never learned the truth of what became of April, and while Gloria wishes it were different, she believes her daughter is gone. It's now a matter of locating her remains and giving her a proper burial, and a place for her loved ones to visit and mourn her. When asked about April's last years, her struggles, the people she was surrounded by, Gloria responded, quote, "So many people don't report their loved ones missing as adults because, well, they're not worthy. That's a prostitute. That's an alcoholic. That's a drug addict. I don't care what they are. They are lives. They have names." The vanishing of April Pitzer has always haunted me. When I first learned of the case back in 2010, there was just something about it which stuck with me. Maybe it was the tragic imagery of a mother digging through 100-year-old caves and mine shafts looking for her missing daughter that just wouldn't get out of my mind. I've watched a lot of video of Gloria Danton, and I'm stunned by her drive and passion and distraught over her emotional strain. Before getting into the theories on this case, I wanted to take a moment to quickly address one aspect of this case that I know I'll be hearing about in the days after this episode releases. April was troubled and fell in with a bad crowd. She made some poor choices and had issues with substance abuse. She was also suffering from bipolar, and that's always a topic close to my heart as I know several people with that diagnosis. In the past, when I've covered a case such as this, I've received some comments about the person not being worthy of an episode, or even implications that this person deserves what happened due to their bad decisions. I don't live in a sheltered world, and I've known and loved people who have had issues with substance abuse. They are of no less value to me because of those issues. If you've been lucky enough to have lived your life without ever having cared about someone who fell into addiction, then I'm glad for you. But that doesn't give your life a greater value in my eyes. People make mistakes, bad things happen, but no one deserves to disappear. I feel a tremendous swell of desire to assist those in need, and it's part of the backbone of this entire podcast to do so. Perhaps if opinions on this matter were different, cases such as these would have more coverage than they do. I should note some discrepancies in this case in relation to what I have told you versus what is available in the media. For those of you who have seen this story on Disappeared, you'll realize much of what you were told here was framed very differently from the way it was told to you on that show. While I appreciate a show like Disappeared and the media in general for the work they do in getting names and cases out there, this discrepancy is hardly a rare incident. Oftentimes, shows and media organizations are tilted based on who agrees to be interviewed and what the narrative is desired to be told. On April's episode, Steve Wilkinson was interviewed and presented as someone who had been involved in crimes in the past, but wasn't currently, when obviously that wasn't true. The entire issue surrounding John Lopez being married wasn't addressed, nor was the manner in which he and April parted ways. A lot of newspaper articles have addressed the case based off that narrative. Many have failed to reach into the true story, and for the most part, coverage of this case remains contained within certain bounds. It was, and always is, my desire to explore these stories for the truth, regardless of what path that leads us down. It may not always be a nice story, but it will be as accurate as I can make it be. Moving into the theories, 14 years have passed since April vanished from Newberry Springs in June of 2004. Considering the wide assortment of suspicious people around her and her connections back to the drug trial in Arkansas, there are a wide variety of theories revolving around this case. While there are suspects local to the area who have become more prominent than others, there are some who feel that after all these years, it's possible that April could have been victimized by someone who has never been considered. And that takes us into the first theory, that April Pitzer was abducted and likely murdered by a completely unknown suspect. Trying to connect the dots of April's testimony to specific names can be a difficult task. There were so many people involved in the trial, and knowing all of the names that would specifically want to target her here can be difficult to narrow down. You're talking about people in jail, their friends and family, criminals who worked the business with them. That's a lot of different people. And while some would argue that 6 years had passed, many of the people sent to prison were still serving time and certainly hadn't forgotten the circumstances that led to their incarceration. Some people can hold grudges, and considering the violence and reach associated with this drug ring and generally all drug rings, it isn't difficult to imagine that someone could have put out a contract on April. She did manage to return to Texas after the trial, but she was forever worried that she would be found there. Her fears, as it seems, were likely grounded in legitimacy. Chuck Hollister, amongst various stories that he told, claimed April had left town with a truck driver and would return in a few weeks. The truck driver aspect is certainly an angle which could have some possibility. We've all heard stories about truck drivers abducting and murdering women, the dangers of truck stops, and if indeed some guy had met April, befriended her, and then took her with him, we would have no real way of knowing. That area of California does see a lot of tractor-trailer traffic, and April didn't have a car, so she was walking everywhere unless she caught a ride. It had happened once in her life that a man had stopped and picked her up already. Luckily, that led her ultimately to Barbara Killebrew, but that doesn't mean someone else with more sinister intentions couldn't have done something similar. The writing on the bathroom wall showing up in Oregon could also make a connection to a truck driver. Someone driving a long distance along the Pacific coast is likely to pass through Oregon at some point, and remember that graffiti was found at a truck stop. It wasn't a normal gas station, it wasn't a general convenience store. Now, I've stopped at truck stops when driving long distances, so that doesn't necessarily mean that a truck driver had to be involved in writing that, but the possibility does exist. Of course, this person who wrote the note specified Barstow, and specifically a deserted area filled with mines, so it's a little more difficult to imagine parking an 18-wheeler along the side of the road and then carrying April up there. But we don't even know for certain that the graffiti is legit. It's never been directly connected to anyone. While it certainly is intriguing, it's hard to know its evidentiary value for certain. There are, though, issues with the truck driver's story on the whole. Firstly, this story would imply that April either went along willingly or was abducted at some point. We know that while she stayed with Chuck, she was working at the Baghdad Cafe, but it's not really a very long walk and doesn't provide a lot of time for April to get offered a ride. It could have happened, but it seems unlikely. Chuck Hollister lived off Caspian Road, which is a little over 2 miles from the cafe. April would be walking to the cafe during daylight hours, and certainly not passing through an area where a big rig was likely to stop and offer someone a ride. Even if that had happened, we know that April continued working at the cafe until shortly before her disappearance, when the owner reported that she had a bruised eye. Perhaps she could have met someone at the cafe itself, but there were no reports of her being especially close to any particular customer, and the population that stops in can be fairly transient. Unfortunately, it's difficult to know what can and cannot be ruled out here. All we have to go on is Chuck Hollister's story about her being in bed when he went to work one day. We don't know for certain where she was, and Hollister is hardly a reliable source of information considering how often he changed his story. If we were to believe his story, then it would suggest that April decided to leave for 3 weeks with a truck driver. She didn't take any of her belongings with her, didn't notify her mother, who she knew was worried about her, and then never returned for reasons unknown. The idea that this was a truck driver is possible, but doesn't seem to make a great deal of sense. April did have terrible luck, it seems, in terms of ending up in a place surrounded by people who had a reason to want to harm her, but could her luck have gotten even worse in terms of meeting a guy who then abducted her? Another name which has been thrown around a little bit is her former boyfriend, Mike Brunel. During the incident where April ended up shot in the leg, the story told by Brunel was that Chuck and Danton had gone crazy, were messed up on drugs, and accused them of stealing. They later supposedly held him captive and ultimately shot at April for helping free him. April's story was slightly different, with her contending that Brunel was in fact the one who was all doped up at the time, and his erratic behavior led to a violent confrontation. Ultimately, it's difficult to know what actually happened here, but Brunel is a person some believe may have wanted to harm April. The two had previously been in a relationship, and April had lived with him, and he was involved in drug activity. After discovering that she was a confidential informant, he'd likely have some reasoning to want to silence her, and that's part of the problem. Most of the people who would have something to hide and who were up to no good wouldn't feel very secure about knowing that April was alive out there somewhere. Even if she told them the reasoning behind becoming an informant, it doesn't mean they'd believe her. To them, it's just as likely she was either involved in that situation still, or that if she got busted for something, they knew she'd roll over on them to save herself. This is not the kind of reputation you want to have around people like this. There was a rumor circulating at the time that Brunel had abducted April, driven her out to the desert where she was beaten, shot up with drugs, and left to die. The story carries a very similar plot to the one Wilkinson told about how he'd treated a woman who he believed had stolen drugs from him. The connecting theme is that the woman Wilkinson supposedly did it to was another girlfriend of Brunel's. What the actual story here is can be difficult to discern, but it's enough to gather information that April was around very dangerous people, and almost any of them could have been involved in her disappearance. Whether it was Brunel, a truck driver, or someone yet unknown is a possibility, though perhaps not the most likely scenario. Most people believe someone closer to April was responsible, and that leads us to the second theory. Many believe that Steve Wilkinson was involved in April's disappearance. The drug dealer had a long rap sheet and had been arrested and convicted of multiple crimes related to drugs and violence over the years. He himself admitted that he was serving time in a federal prison when April testified, due to his own connection to the drug ring, though at the time her identity was revealed, that was a detail he didn't know. In his mind, April had been an informant, and her words could have been partially responsible for him ending up in jail. For a guy like that, it isn't difficult to imagine that he would want to strike back, and if the story about him beating and tasing a woman is true, this wouldn't have been the first time. I read one particular article in which an anonymous source said that Wilkinson ruled that area of the desert with an iron fist. It certainly seems like he had ways of controlling people. Wilkinson became close to April, at least close enough that she felt comfortable staying at his place from time to time. He claimed she stayed there a few weeks after her identity was revealed, though many have questioned that. If April knew that Wilkinson was violent and what he was capable of, and she also knew that he was connected to Brandy Brooks, a woman whom she had testified against, it's difficult to buy that, as paranoid as she was, she'd have felt safe and comfortable there. In his interview with Disappeared, Wilkinson spoke well of April and seemed to portray that he cared about her and wanted what was best, but we also know that a lot of his behavior on the show was a put-on of him pretending to be very different than how he actually functioned in everyday life. If Wilkinson had the kind of personality where he would torture a woman to find out who had stolen 20 pounds of marijuana from him, one would have to imagine that he would be much more brutal and violent with someone who he believed may have put him in jail, cost him a great deal of money, and also disturbed the life of a woman he was close to in Brandy Brooks. Many have suggested the possibility that Wilkinson may have used his closeness with April to disarm her and to eventually lead her into a situation from which she couldn't escape. He may have tortured April to try and ascertain whether or not she had informed on him during her time in California, or he may have simply wanted revenge for her actions in the past. We really have no way of knowing, but to say Wilkinson was certainly capable of being involved in this is very apparent. Interestingly, police have never had much to say about Wilkinson's possible involvement. Their focus has always been on other people, namely Danton. That being said, it wouldn't be difficult to assume Wilkinson was beyond capable of having committed this crime, but would he have wanted to directly get his hands dirty? That's where a lot of people believe that he'd likely have called in a favor, paid someone, or used manipulation to get someone else to carry out his dirty work. Having operated at a major level in the drug trade in that area for decades, Wilkinson would likely have had a lot of options when it came to eliminating someone that he considered a threat. During his disappeared interview, he even made the statement that a lot of bodies had been buried in the desert, and once they're out there, they're never found. I don't want to speculate about the whole ordeal around the plane crash. It has its own massive amount of theory surrounding it. Many believe that Wilkinson may have faked his death in that crash, and while it's a possibility, there's a lot to that event. Sure, the purchase of life insurance seems suspicious, but if the guy knew he was going to jail, perhaps he was just trying to leave something behind for his wife, knowing that he'd eventually die in there. The one aspect of the plane crash which has raised a lot of suspicions is the theory that Wilkinson may have taken April's body with him. It's been said that, in one of the mines while being searched, they found an area which had been dug out recently. It's also been said that Wilkinson was rumored to have been in the area of that mine in the weeks leading up to the plane crash. Is it possible he could have removed her remains in order to dispose of them elsewhere? Sure, but why? Even if April's remains were located, it had been 11 years at that point. There likely wasn't a lot of forensic evidence left behind, and even if there were, would it point to Wilkinson or someone else? Also, if Wilkinson knew the exact location where she could be found, that implies that he had much more directly been involved with what happened, rather than just hiring someone to do it. If she hadn't been found in all of that time, I don't know why he would find it necessary to move her, and if the theories are right, and he was planning to fake his own death in the plane crash, then it would be even less likely to move her. The flight is definitely suspicious, and there are angles to it which don't make sense, but we may never know the full truth of what happened there, and as far as law enforcement is concerned, Steve Wilkinson is dead. So if he wasn't directly involved in April's death, is it possible he knew who was? That leads us to our final theory. Since day one, the two names most closely associated with April's disappearance are Chuck Aleister and Danton. The two men, having been in the area for a long time, who were known to get high frequently and had a propensity towards violence. While Aleister was looked at by a lot of people as a nice old man who was willing to lend a hand, we also have to remember that he was involved in incidents such as the one which led to April getting shot in the leg. Danton has been speculated to have been a very violent person who wasn't afraid to kill, and many believe he had killed in the past. His knowledge and understanding of the mines in that area, specifically the Red Dog mine, gave him a fairly vast network of places to conceal a great many secrets. His warnings written all over the shacks of that area certainly implied that he'd be willing to kill someone who he felt was invading his territory, if you take them seriously. Both men were Vietnam veterans who had been in bloody situations during the war. It's been suggested that one or both may have suffered from psychological issues resulting from their time in Vietnam. While the story April told her mother was that Chuck and Danton had a falling out, and that may have been true, it's hard to imagine that if it came down to it, Chuck would choose to protect her over Danton, who he had known for longer and knew could possibly come after him. Remember, if Chuck went out of his way to protect April, she would eventually be gone, and he'd still be living surrounded by a lot of people who knew his routine and had a reason to be angry with him. It's hard to imagine he'd be willing to risk his life for her. The question becomes whether or not these two would have wanted to harm April in the first place, since they've really played no part in the drug trade. They were users, but no one has ever connected them to distributing or being attached to the ring. It isn't hard to imagine that something could have happened one night which led to one or both of them having some kind of a break, being super doped up or just violent and angry, which could have led to April's demise. But for many, it's likely that if either of these men played a part in this story, it's because they were paid to do so, either in cash or in drugs. Chuck is a little more mysterious here, but considering the stories he told after April vanished, most people, including the police, believe he knew more than he was saying. Danton has always been a prime suspect for law enforcement involved in this case. From his violent past to his erratic behavior, his knowledge of the mines and his close connection to Wilkinson certainly make him a highly viable suspect. For someone who was allegedly willing to kill for money or drugs, who has the ability to conceal a body in a place where no one will ever find it, and who had shot April at least once before, this isn't a highly complicated scenario to try and figure out. The problem is proving it and finding April's remains. Danton swore to almost everyone that ever asked him that he didn't know what happened to April, and yet the first major rumors were that she was murdered and put into a mine shaft. These immediately made police suspect him. Allegedly, leading up to his death, he admitted that he had killed April and that Gloria was looking in the right place, but she hadn't gone far enough. Detective Pennington believed that meant that April was in fact in a mine somewhere in Ludlow, but they hadn't found it yet. Others believed this meant that April's body was actually in the Red Dog mine, and that there were areas of it which they had yet to discover. If Danton did make these statements, if he was truly responsible, then the answer seems to be that April truly is somewhere in a mine in that area. It's not hard to imagine that Danton would kill for whatever reason he may have had, and Wilkinson would have been willing to pay to eliminate someone he wanted revenge against and considered a threat. One question really is, could April have been allowed to leave Newberry Springs alive? She had been around so much, she had seen drug deals going down. When Wilkinson was later arrested, there was a huge stash of drugs in his home. April had stayed there. She had likely seen a lot of things. This would make her a threat to Wilkinson, and who knows how many other people. Once April's identity was revealed, and she hesitated to exit as soon as possible, her death warrant was likely signed. Knowing that she stayed at Chuck's, Danton knew the property and Chuck's schedule. He had stayed there over the years. It wouldn't be difficult to get inside and abduct April, with or without Chuck's consent. The sheer fact of the matter is, anyone who had the information necessary to solve this case is likely gone or believed to be. Now it's a matter of searching for one woman over miles and miles and thousands of mines. For many, Danton was the man who knew where to look, because he was the one who placed April somewhere down there in the snaking network of tunnels, but he can no longer provide that location. For most people, April's last moments were likely in Danton's presence, either by his own choice or under the proposition of Steve Wilkinson. The Vanishing of April Pitzer is a heartbreaking, frustrating story which involves so many different moving parts and people that it can be difficult to really get a grip on what happened. Take a moment to imagine that you are Gloria Danton, that your daughter has vanished and you're trying desperately to locate her. Try to picture putting yourself down into the dark, stagnant mines in the desert of California, in the sweltering heat, digging through the blackness, surrounded by trash, dead animals, broken down tunnels and pits which drop down hundreds of feet without a way to navigate them or escape if you fell in. You breathe in the acrid air with dirt and grime under your nails, in your hair, all over your clothes, digging, searching, crawling through, both begging to know the answers and afraid of what you may find. But you keep going because she was your daughter. You love her, and you believe it's your duty as a parent to never stop trying. The number of places where April could be are nearly limitless, and yet there are those who have scoured hundreds of mines in search of her, and yet thousands more remain. All it would take is for one person who knows the truth to come forward and reveal where she might be found. This one gesture could grant one family the closure necessary to say goodbye, and to have a place to lay flowers when they visit. It could be done anonymously. It could be done in a single phone call, and it could help so many lives. Until someone comes forward, or one of these searches reveals April's final fate, this case sadly remains open, unsolved, and very cold. If you're looking for more information about the vanishing of April Pitzer, there are many forums and websites which discuss the case. Disappeared did an episode on the case, though rather shallow, is a point that you could start. April's mother runs the Facebook page April Pitzer is Missing, so give it a like and show her some love. She has worked so hard for these 14 years trying to find her daughter. The YouTube channel Mojave Underground TV did an episode featuring some of their searching in the cave system. It is Season 1, Episode 9. The podcast Unfound conducted an extensive interview with Gloria, which is filled with important information and gives a new angle to this case. If you have any information about the vanishing of April Pitzer, please contact Detective Steve Pennington at 909-387-3589, Detective Kelly Craig at 760-256-4838, or you can leave an anonymous tip at 1-800-78-CRIME. That's 1-800-783-7463. You can also leave an anonymous tip at the website wetip.com. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at TraceEvPod, message me on Instagram at TraceEvidencePod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. I want to give a special shout out to Patreon producers Krista Colvin, Diane Dyson, Kate Alexander, Lucy LaRue, Lynn Mershell, and Sarah Burrow. Make sure you check your emails, as I'm awaiting responses from several of you regarding your Trace Evidence gear. Your support makes this show possible. If you're interested in supporting Trace Evidence, visit patreon.com/traceevidence. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate and review the show on iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever podcast app you're using. The more ratings and reviews the show gets, the more people are able to hear these unsolved cases. For more information about other cases, transcripts, media, and more, please visit the website at trace-evidence.com. I want to thank all of you for listening, and I hope you'll join me next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.